I've been working with the Necromancer on every season of Diablo 4, and this is my favorite build for Season 2. It's insanely strong, and it's a ton of fun to use. This build is a shadow damage over time build, and it's heavily focused on applying as many sources of shadow damage as you possibly can, stacking insane damage over time and proccing X-Fells for millions and millions of damage. I just dropped Uber Lilith with it, and I've been taking out super high nightmare dungeons with ease and no issue. This build is a ton of fun. You've got to check this out. So let's dive right into the build. We're not going to be using any of our basic abilities at all. Just going to put in 2 points just so you can go down to the core. We are going to be using Blight's core. The main reason being we want to get supernatural Blight, and that is because you deal 15% increased damage to enemies on top of that Blight with all of your damage sources, including your damage over time. You want to have Hued Flesh to drop more corpses as you're dealing damage. Very important on this build because corpses are gold on this build. You want to have Blood Mist, and you want to spec into Blood Mist drops a corpse every second, and you want to max and get as many points into Blood Mist as possible because it's always nice to have a get out of jail free button, but also because we're going to be making Blood Mist shadow damage over time, and it's actually very useful on this build in this specific season. We want to max out Corpse Explosion, specifically the Blighted Corpse Explosion, because it releases that Shadow Miasma, adding another source of shadow damage over time. And this is our main source of damage while we're waiting for cooldowns, and pretty much anytime you see an available corpse that isn't used for something more specific. You want to get down to Fueled by Death, so add a point into Grim Harvest. Fueled by Death is incredibly strong. Every time you utilize a corpse, you just gain increased damage. And if you find Fueled by Death on a necklace or stuff like that, it's super strong. It just adds a fair amount of damage pretty much at all times. You want to put points into Decrepify, specifically Abhorrent Decrepify, one of the best skills on the Necromancer. I highly suggest you use it on every single build because it makes it so your cooldowns have a chance of being reduced by 1 second on Lucky Hit, and you're going to be speccing heavy into Lucky Hit on this build. So you want to have 1 point in Decrepify there, some points into Death's Embrace. You deal more damage while close, and you take less damage while close. This build relies on you being on top of the enemy, so this is a no-brainer. And then Amplify Damage. You deal more damage when you have a curse on an enemy, since you're always going to have Decrepify on enemies. Just more damage. You want points in Corpse Tendrils, just nice for grouping mobs. I think it's really strong, especially doing that vulnerable, guaranteeing vulnerable on enemies when you're pulling them in. Keeps everybody on top of that damage over time section and deals a ton of damage. You want to put some points into Gloom, Reaper's Pursuit, and Crippling Darkness. You only really need 1 in Crippling, and I wouldn't suggest putting any into Terror. I just don't think it's as worth it. I think you could utilize those points elsewhere. And you really want Necrotic Carapace. Just every time you drop a corpse, you also fortify for 6% of your life. Going down to the final tree, you want to put some points in these passives as you will be using no minions at all in this build. It just makes it so you get more damage reduction and you get more utilization of the sacrifice bonuses. And then you want to put Bone Storm on, and you want to get Supreme Bone Storm, just adding more crit for your pops of your key aspect, which is Shadow Blight, or your key passive, Shadow Blight. Because Shadow Blight can crit, seeing some pretty high pops in the 5 millions from my damage over time. Before we get into the gear, I want to talk about the vampiric powers that I use specifically on this build. And you might say, why do you have 4? Well, actually, if you use these specific 4, you physically cannot get any more packs or any more abilities because these 4 require the max amount of packs that you possibly can have. And realistically, it's not that hard to get the packs that you need. Just go run some of that new Blood Harvest stuff and you'll get plenty of packs and cleanses so you can put whatever you want on specific gear. The packs that I use are Metamorphosis. This makes it so when you evade, you turn into a cloud of bats and you move a significant distance. It's almost like a teleport. And being a Necromancer, we have very little movement. This is a must. It keeps you in the fight, especially on major bosses like Uber Lilith. A Curse Touch is another lucky hit that guarantees that you inflict Vampiric Curse on enemies. And your stored souls, when you use Blood Mist, you'll realize at the bottom of you'll see of these curses, it says an enemy affected by your vampiric curses restores their soul, and then casting a Macabre skill will unleash the stored souls, and you can hold up to 8. This just makes it so those souls do a ton of damage. But honestly, the main thing here is applying curse on lucky hit. You deal 60% increased damage over time to enemies that are affected by Vampiric Curse. You can see how impactful these two are together. They're an absolute must. And then last but not least, we have you deal 16% increased damage to vulnerable enemies. And the nice thing is enemies are vulnerable while they're affected by Vampiric Curse. So you just deal 16% increased damage on top of the 60 that you do here. Overall, these 4 are perfect for this build. There is some others you could slot in, but I've tested them and this seems like the best 4. For the Book of the Dead, I sacrifice Reapers to get that 15% shadow damage. It's going to help us on our shadow damage over time. I sacrifice Cold Mages for the 15% increase in vulnerable damage. I sacrificed Golem, I sacrificed the Blood Golem just to increase my life by 10%, but honestly, the 10% increased attack speed is good for damage over time as well. I would argue that this is a strong one, but during Lilith, I found that extra 10% was kind of worth it for me because I tried to do it at a super low level with very minimal Paragon points. I ended up getting it done, but this is a very strong option too. I wouldn't harp on using attack speed just because it adds actually more damage over time ticks. So for my gear, I'm going to show you what I've got, and this is very OD. Like I said, I really spec'd into using some uniques and such to take down Uber Lilith, but none of this is necessary. I'd say the main things that you need that are necessary for the build, which I'm going to highlight first, are right here. You deal 170% increased damage up to 180. Increased damage for 6 seconds after your Shadow Blight key passive damages an enemy 10 times. That burst in damage, that increase in damage during that period is absolutely obscene, and it is a must for this build. I highly recommend that you put it on your necklace. Another must right here is that your Bone Storm turns into a darkness skill. This is a absolute must, and so is this, where your Blood Mist also turns into a darkness skill. Getting the best rolls on those as possible are very important, because if you can stack those on top of each other and run into a boss or run into a group of mobs, their health will start ticking, and eventually they will just be deleted, especially when a lucky hit procs. Which you can find from running Duriel is X-Falls. X-Falls is essentially men down, but for damage over time. It adds some lucky hit, it adds a ton of damage over time, and it makes it so when you proc lucky hit, there's a 50% chance for your DOT to erupt, dealing almost 40k, up to 40k damage of the same type. This is an incredibly strong ring, and obviously it makes your build OD and super strong. It's not necessary, but when you get it, you're gonna love it. Another good one I have is you deal 25% increased damage with barrier active, and another really strong part of the build is going to be that you have a barrier every time you use your Bone Storm. It makes it so you do 5% of your life every single tick. It's very strong, makes you almost invulnerable when you have your Bone Storm up. You can just face check every enemy, and with the Born Decrepify, you're going to constantly reduce that cooldown to make sure that your Bone Storm is up as much as possible. A part of the build which I think is slept on, but I think is pretty common to get in uniques for Necromancers, is Howl from Below. I absolutely love these gloves. Anytime there's a corpse on the ground that I think could be utilized, I am clicking Corpse Explosion. It's running at the enemy and it's applying DOT on the ground. It's heat seeking these enemies. This is, in my opinion, unbelievably strong. It adds a fair amount of lucky hit to your build. I'd say this is really strong too, but outside of that, you can get a pair of gloves. For example, I had some gloves I was using for a long time that adds a ton of shadow damage over time, but I think it's really great to have. I also got these Godslayer helmet recently from Duriel. It makes it so you deal 60% increased damage to 3 seconds after damaging a boss. What else can I say? That's just a ton of damage. And then another really cool pair of pants I got was these Tybald's Will. Whenever you become unstoppable, you do more damage. So it's nice when you use your Bat Dash, it counts as an unstoppable. And then obviously when you use Blood Mist, that's unstoppable. So your Bat Dash is constantly going to add to more damage, and so is your Blood Mist. It just works great for this DOT style build. But I have other pants that I was rocking before that. I just think these are good replacements. And then these boots do not really fit this build at all, but I like them simply because they had 3 additional dashes on them. And when you have that Bat Dash, it's super strong. Especially, I was just doing this for Uber Lilith. There's other boots that I could slot in for this instead. It does add lucky hit with shadow damage, which is the main reason I slotted it on for Uber Lilith. But I had before this Blood Mist triggers Corpse Explosion. This is really good for like Nightmare dungeons, and you have movement speed on here. Actually, these boots are far better for the build. If you can get ones with Blood Mist on it, they're super strong too. You don't necessarily need these Greaves. I'd say if you have Greaves that add dodges and have some movement speed, you should be set ski Wayne Gretzky. But I just think the shadow damage over time lucky hit chance was kind of nice. Before I get into the Paragon board, I'm just going to quickly walk you through what my skill rotation is without really going into anything crazy. It's just simple for you to understand. When I see a group of mobs, I'm going to launch a Blight at them to put that DOT on the ground. I then can use my Blood Mist with Bone Storm. If I have it up, Bone Storm up, Blood Mist to dash through and drop a bunch of corpses. And since I don't have Explosion on my boots right now, it's kind of nice to leave the corpses on the ground. Then I'll Corpse Tendrils them onto that shadow damage that's provided on the ground from all my moves so far. And then I will constantly Corpse Explode everything around with all the corpses, and they will all be deleted. It's so much fun. It feels super athletic, super fast. It's just a really, really, really good build. Decrepify before you dive in as well. I should have mentioned that. When you Blight, immediately Decrepify every group. So before we get into the Paragon, I want to mention that I really don't have that many Paragon points. I did a lot. I like to challenge myself when I face Uber Lilith on every season. So I did this one at 95. And as you can see, I don't have my bonus Paragon points here, or here. I'm missing 16 points off the rip from the map alone. But I'll still show you kind of how I laid it out. real quick for you. And I begin with the glyph socket that makes it so ideal. 10% increased damage with no active minions. It's just a nice solid damage boost off the rip. I like that 10% increased damage. And there's some replacements that you can put here, but honestly, the fact that you get that 10% increased damage at all times without any conditions is more valuable than you might think. Like, for example, if you do one that you deal more increased damage with every corpse around, but the thing is with this build is I'm using those corpses as soon as I see them, so I don't always have that 12% increased damage up. I think having this always affected is super important, so I do suggest sacrificial at first. Moving up the board, I go into Scourge for shadow damage over time, and I heavily spec into intelligence here. There is some more points I could put in, but like I said, I don't have that many Paragon points. I'm knocking nearly every single shadow damage over time node on my way that I can, and then I reach over and grab Wither, press through the top here, and I head into the Flesh Eater tree. I go right to the left side, but I do hit this glyph socket spot where I pop in darkness, just additional shadow damage. Everything is about shadow damage for DOT. Sliding into the next side, I go into the Bloodbath tree, but I don't obviously touch that point. Instead, I stay on the right side. I go immediately to the closest glyph I possibly can to head out. I hit this glyph, and I do with damage while close to enemies. Since I'm always going to be on top of the enemies, it's a very strong, very, very strong glyph. And you get 10% reduction, hitting some of this damage while fortified on the way. Progressing forward, I go into the Scent of Death, which is a great node to select at the end. I also grab in some damage to healthy. And then I progress to the glyph tree, and I pop in damage while healthy, since I'm nearly always going to be shielded up, healthy, and vulnerable. This is great. And you get 30% increased potion healing as well, which doesn't hurt. But then I hit the nodes for damage to injured enemies. This is roughly what I'm rocking with right now. I will put in the description this written guide out there so you have something to reference. I typically do that for my end game builds, but not really for my leveling builds. A lot of people in the leveling build were asking where it was. I'm typically figuring this out while I'm leveling to make sure it's as optimal as I can feed you guys. So I don't really do it for the leveling builds, but it's always going to be there for my end game builds. That's going to do it for this build today. If you like this kind of content, going over to my Twitch and hitting the follow button, subscribing down below here are the best ways to support me. I appreciate all the love and all the comments, and I'll see you guys very soon.